When you picture a Roman legionary, your imagination inevitably paints a flawless, emotionless machine forged for slaughter. Hollywood has spent decades conditioning us to accept this image of a grim, ironclad lone wolf, whose only true family was his legion, and whose only genuine love was the unattainable glory of Rome. We are shown hard men devoid of any soft human attachments, ready to die without a second thought. But this is a magnificent, beautifully packaged historical lie that conceals what is arguably the greatest, most sincere, and most deeply tragic passion in the life of the ancient soldier. If you could somehow peer into the hardened soul of a veteran, you would not find a fanatical thirst for eternal glory. Instead, you would uncover a desperate, all-consuming, and strictly forbidden passion for a normal human existence. They harbored a desperate craving for family, warmth, and domestic peace. The devastating irony is that the greatest empire in human history, a state that loudly championed traditional family values, committed an act of unprecedented psychological cruelty against its primary defenders. Emperor Augustus issued an ironclad decree that strictly forbade all active-duty legionaries from entering into a legal marriage. Consider the sheer magnitude of this tragedy. A man who surrendered 25 years of his life to defend the borders of civilization was legally stripped of the right to enjoy the fruits of that civilization. The empire operated on a foundation of ice-cold logic. A married soldier is fundamentally a vulnerable soldier. A man whose mind is consumed by thoughts of a sick wife or a hungry child back home might hesitate in the shield wall. A man burdened by a weeping family cannot simply pack his gear and endure a forced march across the continent. Therefore, the state deliberately attempted to artificially transform its legionaries into heavily armed martial monks. But human nature and basic biological instincts cannot be legislated out of existence by the Senate. This cruel prohibition on love did not destroy it. It merely drove it relentlessly into the deep shadows, making this forbidden passion the most powerful, painful, and obsessive emotional need of every single legionary. The laws of Rome were undeniably severe, written in stone and enforced by the sword. But the raw reality of life on the wild frontiers of the empire always dictated its own unwritten, organic rules. The moment a marching legion halted, built its perfectly level camp, and settled in one location for longer than a few tense months, something truly remarkable began to materialize around its impenetrable walls. Just beyond the deep defensive trench, an entirely different, spontaneous city would relentlessly grow, the sprawling settlements known as the Canabi. These were noisy, filthy, chaotic shantytowns consisting of the ramshackle huts of opportunistic merchants, tavern keepers, and, most importantly, women. It was precisely here, within this confusing labyrinth of narrow, muddy streets thick with the smell of cheap wine and roasting meat, that the legionaries pursued their greatest state-forbidden passion. Here, they built their shadow, completely unofficial families. The woman with whom a soldier secretly shared his life was called a focaria, the keeper of the hearth. These were absolutely not casual, fleeting one-night stands. In the vast majority of cases, these were incredibly deep, fiercely loyal, and decades-long unions cemented by genuine love. If you are fascinated by this hidden, profoundly human, and incredibly dramatic side of real history that sterile school textbooks stubbornly refuse to mention, subscribe to our channel right now. We strip away the glossy Hollywood filters and show you the authentic lives of the people whose sweat and blood literally poured the foundation of our modern world. The legionaries would return from days-long, physically devastating border patrols, wash off the ingrained grime and dried blood, strip off their heavy armor, and under the cover of night, sneak past the camp gates. They walked into the dark slums to embrace their unofficial wives and to play with the children that Roman law disgustingly refused to acknowledge. In the early morning hours, this man was a ruthless, terrifying cog in a perfect killing machine, practicing lethal thrusts with his gladius. But in the evening, crossing the invisible boundary into the cannabis, this merciless killer instantly melted into a gentle, fiercely protective father. These disenfranchised women served as a vital emotional anchor that prevented the soldiers from losing their minds to the surrounding brutality. The heaviest, most unbearable burden of this secret, double life, was the precarious legal status of their own children. This was the exact agonizing problem that kept hardened legionaries awake at night, staring blankly at the ceiling of their leather tents. As far as the flawless, unyielding system of Roman law was concerned, a child born to an active duty soldier and his devoted Focaria legally did not exist as a recognized member of society. In the dry, unforgiving official documents of the provincial magistrates, these innocent children were branded with a cruel, humiliating legal stigma, spurious, which bluntly meant illegitimate. They were flatly denied the highly coveted prize of Roman citizenship, even if their biological father was a pure-blooded Roman, hailing from an ancient, respected lineage. They possessed absolutely no legal right whatsoever to inherit their father's property, money, or land. If a legionary perished in a brutal frontline massacre, and on the volatile borders of the barbarian world, this happened with catastrophic frequency, his unofficial, grief-stricken widow and his young, vulnerable children were instantly thrown onto the literal street. They were left completely without state pensions, without legal protection, and without the right to claim the meager savings that the soldier had painstakingly accumulated over long years in the legion's secure treasury. All of his hard-earned, blood-soaked money was ruthlessly confiscated by the state or sent away to distant official relatives back in Italy. Just try to imagine the fragile psychological state of a man standing in the locked front rank of the legion, staring down a furious horde of charging warriors. He grips his heavy wooden shield until his knuckles turn white, driven not only by the natural fear for his own life, but by a paralyzing, blood-chilling terror for his invisible family waiting nervously just behind the battle lines. He knows with absolute certainty that if a barbarian axe crashes through his helmet, his beloved woman will be forced to beg or sell her body to survive, and his son will inevitably become a voiceless slave. This constant, background, gnawing anxiety actually made the legionaries even more ferocious and uncompromising in battle. Defeat meant the physical destruction of the people they loved most. Living for decades in this grueling, high-stakes regime formed a highly unique, deeply fractured psychological profile among the legionaries. They existed in a perpetual state of agonizing cognitive dissonance, constantly torn between the absolute duty of the soldier and the bleeding heart of the father. Inside the strict, mathematically perfect square of the castrum, The legionary obeyed the iron, merciless discipline of Rome without question. There was zero room for sentimentality or pity. It was a realm ruled exclusively by death and cold military order. But the moment he stepped outside the fortress gates, he entered an entirely different universe where he was loved unconditionally. Not for his ability to hold a shield wall, but simply for who he was. Maintaining this exhausting double life demanded colossal self-control. Soldiers would spend years meticulously scraping together their meager pay, hiding silver coins in secret compartments. The overwhelming majority of this hard-earned, blood-stained money was not blown on cheap wine and dice games, as the lazy stereotypes would have you believe. The money was secretly funneled into buying warm imported fabrics for their foccaria, hand-carved wooden toys for their hidden children, and desperate attempts to create a fleeting sense of domestic comfort. To this day, archaeologists working in the ruins of Roman frontier forts hold their breath as they unearth thousands of incredibly moving artifacts. Tiny children's leather sandals, painstakingly stitched to look exactly like a soldier's heavy marching boots. Delicate women's hairpins, lovingly carved from animal bone, and small bronze rings bearing touching, clumsily scratched inscriptions that read, "Love me as I love you." These small, fragile objects are the silent, honest witnesses to a massive, hidden ocean of love. The high command of the legions, the strict centurions and legates, were perfectly aware of this massive, systemic violation of imperial law. But they consciously chose to turn a blind eye. They clearly understood that an army composed of lonely, hopeless men is infinitely more prone to bloody mutinies than an army of fathers who have something precious to lose. But when a legion received sudden orders to relocate, true hell began. Unofficial families by the thousands had to follow the marching army on foot, swallowing blinding road dust, because the empire bluntly refused to provide them with any protection. Yet, at the very end of this long, grueling, 25-year drama filled with deprivation, pain, and hidden terror, there stood one great, shining objective. There was one solitary beacon of hope that prevented the soldiers from surrendering to despair. A light that guided the legionary through decades of spilled blood, blistered feet on endless marches, and constant, grinding humiliation. This ultimate, most desperately coveted goal in the life of every Roman soldier was called the honesta missio, the honorable military discharge granted after completing one's full term of service. If a soldier somehow miraculously survived the endless meat grinder of the savage border wars, if he didn't succumb to mundane dysentery in a muddy camp, and if he wasn't executed for a minor infraction, after 25 agonizing years, he finally received the ultimate prize. In a grand, solemn ceremony, he was handed his military diploma, 2 small, unassuming bronze tablets securely bound together with a copper wire and stamped with imperial seals. In that precise moment, a genuine, profound legal miracle occurred, the very miracle for which oceans of sweat and tears had been shed. These cold, heavy pieces of metal were, in essence, a magical artifact capable of completely rewriting the destiny of an entire bloodline. The emperor's decree, permanently struck into the ringing bronze, granted the aging, scarred veteran not just a fertile plot of land or a solid lump sum of retirement silver. It granted him something infinitely more valuable, the legal, unquestionable right to marry. The woman who had faithfully waited for him for a quarter of a century, who had hidden in terror with their children in the woods during barbarian raids, instantly, with the snap of a magistrate's fingers, became a fully recognized, deeply respected, legal Roman matron. And all of his children, who had lived their entire lives carrying the shameful stigma of being illegitimate, received in a single second, full, unassailable Roman citizenship. The battered veteran finally earned the right to stand in public and proudly name his son as his rightful heir. The Roman Empire was not built solely on a fanatical hatred of its enemies. It was built on the desperate, deeply buried desire of a simple, exhausted soldier to one day just go home, embrace his family legally, and live in peace.